Everyone, and welcome to our very first joint webinar with Peach, CAPE, and the OMA Green as Health. We are so happy to be starting back up again after a short summer break, and we're all very excited about a new year with a more unified physician voice on all things climate and healthcare. And this joint webinar series is just one piece of that, so thank you so much for coming out. I think it is very fitting that we're going to be starting this year off with such an incredible first guest today, who truly needs no introduction, but I will give a short one anyway. Elizabeth May has served as a leader of the Green Party of Canada from 2006 to 2019 and returned as leader of the party in November of 2022. She's the Green Party's first elected member of parliament, representing the Saanich Gulf Islands in 2011, and continues as the member of parliament. She's done extensive work volunteering in environmental movements since the 1970s and has received countless awards for her environmental advocacy, being named an Officer of the Order of Canada in 2005 in recognition of decades of leadership in the Canadian environmental movement. And of course, she's only continued since then. I personally had the pleasure of meeting Elizabeth back in April of this year at a Canadian Cancer Society event on Parliament, and was fortunate enough to speak with her about the incredible group of physicians that I'm a part of working on tackling climate change issues within healthcare. At that time, she so graciously agreed to, find a time to come and speak with some passionate physicians, and here we are today. So I want to mention that after Elizabeth speaks for a little bit, please have some questions ready because we're hoping to make this a pretty interactive event. So without further ado, I will let the incredible Elizabeth May take it away for us.
Thanks, Max. What a lovely introduction. Thank you so much for having me. And I have to say, having worked out, and I'll step back and kind of give a brief chronology of my work in climate over the years, but started working in the area of climate change in 1986. Actually, I remember exactly when I started getting really involved. But the emergence of a strong agenda of the climate crisis and how it affects human health, and the emergence of physicians' voices into the debate is an extremely exciting development and very positive, and I think helpful in dealing with an issue as complex and challenging as the climate crisis. So I'll just back up a little bit and say the reason I know exactly the year I got involved in climate change was that I'd been doing environmental work as a volunteer. My home was on Cape Breton Island, where my parents had moved us in a sort of romantic adventure episode that lasted the rest of my life. But anyway, they decided to move to a village on Cape Breton Island in 1973. And I'd been an environmental activist at the grassroots level since high school, and I ended up doing enough environmental work locally trying to, as a volunteer, stop the spraying of toxic insecticides from aircraft for a forest pest. I ended up accidentally getting a reputation that was helpful enough that I went from being a waitress and cook at my parents' restaurant to go to Dalhousie Law School without an undergrad degree. And that all happened by 1980. I was a student at Dal Law School. And that all kinds of strange pathways that are unplanned. I ended up being asked in 1986 to become an advisor to the Federal Minister of Environment based on environmental knowledge. So that's where I worked as senior policy advisor for the Minister of Environment in the Mulroney government, without being a member of that party, without having any political agenda. I got recruited to work in the office of the Federal Minister of Environment. And at that point, we were making real progress fighting acid rain, and actually did create the agreements that led to binding agreements between Canada and the provinces, and then between Canada and the US to address acid rain. And then I also worked on the negotiations for the Montreal Protocol that saved the ozone layer, literally, and now the ozone layer is repairing itself. So in contrast to climate, you can imagine how devastating it is to see how ineffective society, global community of nations, and Canada in particular have been in addressing the climate crisis. But I had early successes. And when I was there in the Minister of Environment's office, working with these fantastic scientists, some of whom were leading edge people in why we had to save the ozone layer, successfully negotiating a treaty that actually worked in 1987. But starting in 1986, I got briefings on climate from Canada's leading scientists because I was just there in the room with the Minister of Environment. So back in the mid 80s, there was no debate about the science of climate change. It was presented to the minister the same way acid rain was, or the ozone layers, a set of facts that we all understood that if we continue down this road, the following things may happen. Unfortunately and tragically for humanity, in the case of the climate crisis, it was the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, which is where, as one observer named it, the Carbon Club was born. So at the moment when the community of nations, and that was the biggest ever global summit of all world leaders all together, and looking across the Zoom screen, I think most of you are too young to remember it, but June 92 at the Earth Summit in Rio was where every country on Earth, I mean, and including at that point, the US under George Bush, everybody signed and then subsequently ratified the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We are still operating under that treaty. Every climate negotiation, every agreement, legally binding agreement we have made is within the umbrella of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that includes obviously the Kyoto Protocol in 97, and the Copenhagen Accord, which was a disaster, and the Paris Agreement of 2015, which still holds some promise, although most countries are in flagrant violation, especially Canada. But the opportunity to be educated by climate scientists before the myth of doubt was invented is something that I am deeply grateful for as a grounding in climate. I never, if I'd been told then, God, Rio Earth Summit in 1992, I was holding my not yet, I wasn't 1-year-old, she was just 11 months old at Rio, my daughter. She's now 32. She's made so much progress and the world has made none. But I was holding her as the agreements were signed to protect biodiversity, to act on climate. I'm glad I didn't know then what I witnessed, because I never would have believed we'd get to the point where we are at, where global average temperature has increased to now 1.1 or 1.2 degrees Celsius above what it was before the Industrial Revolution, that we would see so much of the world on fire, so many floods, so many extreme weather events, so many deaths due to the climate crisis. But as I said, the emergence, and thanks to Lancet and other efforts to say, look, we always saw there was a human health and climate link. We talked about it in the 1980s, but it's become obvious and profound. And the voice of physicians, whether through the OMA group or PEACH or Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, thank you all so very much. The next climate meeting, and again, this Framework Convention on Climate Change, I'm going to try to avoid too much, international legalese and UN speak, because it's pretty stultifying. But when you negotiate a treaty globally and it has enough countries signing and then ratifying it to meet its ratification targets, and then it enters into force. So that's the process. But it doesn't just sit there on a shelf. Every treaty, whether biodiversity or ozone or climate, creates essentially its own parliament that meets generally yearly, although the Biodiversity Convention meets every other year. And each one of those is called a Conference of the Parties. I know you've seen it, the COPs. So we have had so many, and we're now heading, and God help us, to COP 28 in Dubai, late November till mid-December. But this one I wanted to mention in particular for two things. One is, in the absence of enforcement mechanisms on climate agreements. By the way, we had enforcement mechanisms on ozone, which is a story I'd love to tell you, but I want to wait and see if it comes up in questions and answers, or we won't be able to get through everything if I go through my historical digressions. But the next COP, as I said, without enforcement mechanisms, the Paris Agreement enforcement is basically group shaming. It's called a global stock take. Can you believe it? That's the language, global, and then one word, stock take. And so we will be gathering in late November, early December in Dubai, where the Conference of the Parties will actually address where are we? Are we on track to our Paris goals of holding to as far below 2 degrees as possible and preferably to 1.5? How far off track are we? What do we need to do? So that's a global stock take, and they will name names and say which country is doing well, which country is doing badly. The other significant thing about Dubai and COP28 is that it is planned that the health and climate shared agenda will have priority. So health ministers are being invited to address the climate meetings. So Canada's new health minister, Mark Holland, is invited. I don't know yet if he's going. This agenda, by the way, in terms of expertise, my friend Courtney Howard, who's an emergency room doctor from Yellowknife, is very involved in this global work, where they've also managed to bring in the World Health Organization and say, okay, now how are we going to address the threat to human health that is manifesting itself through the climate crisis? We know what we need to do. We've known a very, very long time what needed to be done. Just as we knew on ozone and did it, and just as we knew on acid rain and did it, on climate, we knew what needed to be done and chose not to. That's why we have retreating glaciers and melting ice caps and rising seas and extreme weather events of all kinds with increasing severity and increasing frequency. And we will see more of them. The global atmosphere is now baked in. It's the term that's usually used, but it certainly does carry sort of a sense of pun intended. We are baked in for a global increase in global average temperature that at this point is unavoidable. What is still avoidable is the worst case scenario, which no one really wants to talk about, of ever increasing global average temperatures, which themselves create positive feedbacks, such as, for instance, as Canada's forests were on fire this summer, the pulse of carbon to the atmosphere was enormous. By the way, forest fire carbon releases do not count in our carbon budget as a country. When we report to the UN, we don't count our forests burning up. But obviously, the carbon released in burning forests, created by drier conditions and hotter conditions created by the climate crisis, it creates a positive feedback loop to spur more warming, just as losing Arctic ice increases warming of the waters of the oceans, particularly in the Arctic region, because they lose the albedo effect from the sun bouncing back out and the heat bouncing back out to space because the white ice isn't there and the heat soaks into dark ocean water. There are many positive feedback loops, permafrost melt being another, releasing methane. What we must do as a society is avoid those levels of warming that make it inevitable and unstoppable that we have ever increasing global average temperatures such that humanity, or at least human civilization, doesn't survive the next century. We still have a very good chance to avoid that. That's why I'm still working. That's why I believe it's critical that Canada start doing what we promise and show some global leadership, because we still have a good reputation in the world and can actually influence other nations. So it's a struggle, it's a race against time, but the combined efforts of physicians who are looking at, and again, a voice that's really respected in our society is yours. If we're going to save lives now, we need to do two things. We need to stop building new fossil fuel infrastructure, stop expanding fossil fuel production, and significantly reduce how much we rely on fossil fuels. We don't need to do everything tomorrow, but we need to make sure that our global fossil fuel emissions have peaked and begin to fall well before 2025. That was the April 4th, 2022 IPCC report. So we know we can do that. It's basically stop adding and start subtracting and start as soon as possible, like yesterday, but we still can avoid the worst, but not on the track we're on, and not with doublespeak from politicians who think it's fine to say we're all climate leaders here in Canada, but we're going to insist on building the TMX pipeline. By the way, just the other day, our national energy regulator caved to what we own now. It's our shared enterprise, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. The Crown Corporation, we all own this thing, went to the Canadian energy regulator and said, oh, the promise we made to that First Nation, Swetmacook First Nation, it's going to be really expensive if we keep that promise. So we'd like your permission to violate that promise to that First Nation and dredge up their most sacred territory, because it's really going to be expensive to micro tunnel around it. So that's, it's just an appalling abomination that we're building the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And now it's up to $31 billion of public funds to do it. We know what needs to be done. We still got time to do it. And while we're reducing greenhouse gases and making sure that we're not building in new fossil fuel infrastructure, at the same time, we need to understand how to save lives in things like heat domes. It's actually a relative. She's my husband's niece, and her name is Dr. Sarah Kendall. She has rewritten, with one other colleague, the British Columbia protocols for heat domes. The BC government has still not informed all their first responders that this was all rewritten, but the 619 people who died in BC in 4 days in the summer of 2021, most of those lives could have been saved with easy, cheap responses from first responders. And right now, unfortunately, the way the government of Canada has written their adaptation strategy, they assume that you can't save lives till every single Canadian has access to air conditioning. Well, as Dr. Blair Feltmate from University of Waterloo has pointed out, if you lose your electricity supply during a climate event like a heat dome, which is entirely likely, that you tend to lose electricity a lot in extreme weather events, that would have been thousands of people who died instead of hundreds. But what they discovered, and what Sarah Kendall, Dr. Kendall discovered from struggling to try to save lives in a heat dome, was people needed to know basic things like have a cold shower. If you don't have air conditioning, fill a bathtub with cold water, add ice cubes, and keep core temperature as low as possible. These things are not about they could have saved all people who are homeless and on the streets if they had firefighters and policemen lead people into English Bay with guidance and making sure they were safe from drowning. Reduce temperature, get people somewhere cold, get people lots of water. We need to revive the system we used to have when I was a kid, which was there were water fountains everywhere. Public parks, public spaces had water fountains. We've got to bring those back. We've got to make sure people have shade. These are all now about saving lives. And as I said, when we signed the agreements back in 1992, I never would have believed we'd get to the stage where we'd have a Hurricane Fiona and a heat dome and forest fires everywhere, and still have people say we shouldn't be wasting our times on climate change because we need economic development instead. So I'm going to stop there because at this point I will mention by 8:30 your time I should be going to my next event. I want to make sure there's lots of time for questions, conversation, whatever you want to do with me here. I'm just really, really grateful that you've joined the groups you've joined to increase and expand physician engagement in the climate crisis. We really, really need you, and I'd be happy to fill in any gaps. And there are obviously whatever you want to do with me while I'm with you. I'm grateful for your time. And Max, I'll leave it for you to spot the hands going up and let me know how we're going to manage from here.
Max, did you want to say a couple words? If not, I'm happy to facilitate the Q&A.
No, that was fantastic. I think let's jump right into the Q&A. Yeah.
Perfect. Rob, I see you have your hand up. Please go ahead. Feel free to turn your camera on if you're comfortable.
Hi, Elizabeth. I met you back in Glasgow, and I'm going, actually, RNAO is sending me to Dubai this year.
Oh, excellent.
I'll get to see you again there.
Excellent. I do remember you. I don't see I know I don't see your face, but I remember your name. So it's good to see you. And I'm glad you're going to be going to Dubai, although God help us.
I
It's
know.
what bad luck. Egypt in for COP27 and oh my, United Arab Emirates for COP28.
So we're working on a project. So I'm chairing the Ontario Nurses for the Environment right now, and I'm working with Dr. Miles Sargent from Peach, Ontario, and Canadian Coalition for Green Healthcare, as well as the presidents of the Canadian Association for Nurses for the Environment. And we're working on a sustainable procurement or net zero procurement campaign nationally. We also are trying to get carbon labeling as part of the medical product regulations through Health Canada, and then do we're hoping that we can get sustainable procurement as part of the Accreditation Canada process.
Mhm.
And if that works, we're going to go for that. I do have a question though concerning carbon labeling. Would the Consumer Packaging and Labeling Act, could carbon labeling be added to that across all products? So it's not just a niche medical thing, but across all products.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just a matter of changing legislation and changing regulatory practices. I can't see why it couldn't be. And certainly the work to get, if you're able to do it for all sectors, it's probably just a little bit more work than getting it for one sector at a time.
And what
By
would
the way,
be
the fossil fuel lobby will fight like hell. So that's the other thing that interferes with any of these things getting done. If it wasn't for the fossil fuel lobby, we would have solved the climate crisis in decades ago.
Well, that's why we're thinking going through the medical thing first, and then start with one sector, and then hopefully it'll spill into the other sectors. So I guess the fossil fuel lobby is the biggest opponent to it. What could you see movement on that, or is that a waste of time?
Oh my gosh, nothing's a waste of time. You never know where you're going to get a breakthrough. And in product labeling, I mean, we're putting efforts as well into banning advertisements for fossil fuels in the same way. And if we use the trajectory of what worked on cigarettes, that's a good start in terms of where health professionals also have expertise. Labeling made a big difference in getting significant reductions in how many people in Canada smoke. It took obviously it was a lot of work on the cigarette lobby, and actually the fossil fuel industry followed the playbook of the cigarette lobby from the beginning, trying to create the notion of a scientific debate. And I'm old enough to remember when we used to have ads that showed doctors smoking cigarettes and doctors saying, "This is my favorite brand of cigarette." And the United Nations Surgeon General coming out and saying smoking causes lung cancer. The cigarette lobby did, and again, the fossil fuel lobby has followed this pattern. Let's start by making it look like that's a big debate. Let's make sure there's a lot of uncertainty around that. You never know, but what worked for getting reducing cigarette smoking was, and Dr. John Last of University of Ottawa is one who really tracked this and expressed this as redefining the unacceptable as a social statement. It became socially unacceptable to light up a cigarette when you were visiting friends, and who said, "Well, look, this is a no smoking house." When I was a kid, there was no such thing as a no smoking house. So again, redefining the unacceptable. We have to redefine the unacceptable in terms of procurement, in terms of people driving a car all by themselves, social cues for what's acceptable and what isn't. Again, anything that follows a pattern that has worked in the past, and the various steps taken to reduce cigarette smoking are often applicable to what to do to reduce fossil fuel addiction. So it's an area where physicians have a lot of experience in advocacy.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Well, thank you. And thanks to Canadian Nurses Association for the Environment. It's fantastic.
We have some wonderful questions also coming in through our chat. We'll start with Tila's question.
Industrial animal agriculture offers a great option for us to leverage to reduce methane emissions in a short time frame. What are your thoughts about the role of our food system in keeping below 1.5 degrees?
Well, it's a very, very important area because the agriculture sector, particularly confined livestock operations, do produce a lot of methane. So anything that we can do to, for instance, address the production, the type of production, I think to say, I mean, obviously it was a big step forward for the government of Canada to put out a food guide, which reduced the notion that you had to eat meat, and a plant-based diet being advocated through the Canada Food Guide was a big step forward. In terms of industrial production, at least I won't make this a partisan statement, but I think the Greens are the only party that call for an end to industrial livestock operations, because we know that there are certainly some agricultural producers who are producing meat products, and the carbon content, for instance, for small growers of a limited number of animals a year slaughtered locally and feeding a local community, that's a very, very different impact in terms of methane than the mega production and the industrial livestock operations, which should be banned for many reasons, including animal welfare and human health. So it's certainly important in terms of reducing methane. It's also, I think, the confined animal feedlot operations are bad at so many levels for health and the environment, but particularly in methane production. I think, for me anyway, the way I conceptualize it is the best way to go at that sector is to start in terms of where the operations are more recent, more damaging, recent in terms of a couple decades, and where you might get some buy-in from other producers who are not producing methane at the same level because they're not doing the massive industrial feedlot operations.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I also see that since you're also here, did you have anything to add or anything else to ask on that? Oh, I've got a heart. I'm going to say she loves that answer as well. Dr. Roy asked, through CAPE, we are working on trying to close loopholes in the federal CER before the public consultation period expires. Do you have suggestions for the healthcare voice to be most impactful in advocating for this?
Well, now I just want to make sure I understand the question properly, because this is Mealy, sorry. Closing the loopholes in the federal, do you mean the Canadian Energy Regulator? Or is there a different public consultation? This is on methane regs, is what you're saying? I'm just making sure we're still on methane.
Dr. Roy, I saw that you went on camera.
Oh, clean electricity regulations. Okay, thanks. Yeah, the clean electricity regulations, there's a lot of work to be done on that, and not just in the development of the regulations. Let me just flag for you as an area of advocacy to park to the side and just be aware of it. Our biggest obstacle in having 100% decarbonized electricity grid is the power of individual monopolies, province by province. Ontario Hydro, BC Hydro, they don't want to talk to each other. They don't want to sell to each other. They don't want a grid that works. So we need an electricity grid that works, which allows decentralized, more democratized forms of energy. So if every flat roof in the country with, throughout, imagine all the places you can put solar panels. If everybody was producing their own electricity and feeding into the grid, either from windmills or solar panels, feed into the grid what you don't need, get paid for it, pull out of the grid when you do need it. The grid is essentially a giant battery, and it's already there. Our problem is that between provinces, there's like a solid wall. All the grid connectivity is north-south. So Hydro-Quebec can sell to New York State, but Hydro-Quebec can't sell to New Brunswick. It's ridiculous, right? Nova Scotia's electricity is still coming virtually 100% from coal, Quebec Hydro has more than enough electricity to provide all the electricity Nova Scotia needs, but you can't get it any further east than Moncton. I mean, this is inbred, stupid, and I don't know if it's stupid by design, but the way our federation works, the European Union works so much better as 23 separate nation states with 30 official languages than Canada with one federal government, 10 provinces, and 3 territories. We are absolutely unable to work together, and it's maddening. But the European Union, of course, is way ahead of us on reducing greenhouse gases, because within a couple months of the Kyoto negotiations in 97, the European Union had divided up the target between and among all the different countries, and then hit every target and exceeded every target right down the line. So the European Union is on track to be about 45% below 1990 levels in its greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Canada is like over 20% above our 1990 levels. Again, EU 45% below 1990 levels. We're still above and growing. So back to the electricity grid and the meth and getting carbon out of electricity. We're making some progress for sure. We were already about 80% non-carbon electricity through, unfortunately, nuclear reactors, which have no part of a climate solution, but they're the ones that are already there. Okay, they're there, they're producing electricity. It's considered decarbonized. Obviously, there's carbon somewhere, but it's decarbonized. And then we have a lot that comes from hydroelectric. We have to make sure that in terms of how does the healthcare voice be most impactful, which is your question, I think it's through the media. If you can do shared letters that are signed on, like now's the time, here's your prescription from your doctor, shut down coal-fired power plants. I mean, again, the OMA played a huge role in getting Ontario to shut down its coal-fired power plants with the link to asthma. That was a very successful campaign when Michael Purley was running Ontario Medical Association advocacy on that. That's a textbook perfect case of physicians driving the shutdown of coal-fired electricity. To the extent that you can get any Nova Scotia doctors involved, and the provinces that are using coal for electricity right now are Nova Scotia, a bit in Saskatchewan, and a lot in Alberta still. So go after coal-fired electricity. That's the worst. And of course, the government, unfortunately, the Liberals are creating new subsidies to increase electricity production from natural gas, but it's not really natural gas, it's fracked gas with a big impact on methane. And also, of course, it's a fossil fuel, so when burned, it's releasing it. So methane is the upstream emission from fracking to get the gas out of the ground, but where it's burned, it also releases greenhouse gases because it is a fossil fuel, even if they want to pretend it's somehow green. So it's the more you can speak out about the health impacts of dirty air, the imperative that the provinces that are still burning fossil fuels to produce electricity be forced to stop, be enticed to stop, whatever it takes. They have to stop doing this. And for now, the healthcare voice isn't in the mix in the public mind. The debate is about, oh, well, the federal government, the federal Liberals have picked this target, and the target is usually expressed as if it's some sort of political target and in the media, the way they cover it, they act as if it's some sort of mad scheme of Liberals that isn't grounded in science. They don't go back to why did we agree to the Paris target of trying to avoid 2 degrees Celsius and to stay as far below 1.5 degrees as possible. Again, explaining these targets isn't easy because they are not in the kind of language that the average person understands. I mean, 1.5 degrees doesn't sound like anything because we go from plus, we have huge swings winter to summer, plus 30 in the summer, minus 30 in the winter. 1.5 doesn't register with people. We really need anybody's help to communicate this, but in terms of global average temperature, 1.5 is huge. The contribution healthcare professionals can make is to say, people, we emergency visits from asthma, from local air quality that is reduced because we're burning coal for electricity when we've got so many cheaper options. For instance, Alberta is the best placed province for solar energy production. There's some big investments that Daniel Smith just stopped. But if you look at Okotoks, Alberta just put in a big solar facility, and it unlike nuclear or other forms of electricity, you can bring in solar really quickly. Start from the moment the decision is made till you roll out the solar panels is just it's a matter of months, or if not or less than years. The cost is so competitive that the Okotoks, Alberta solar facility came in at less than 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So there's healthcare, because burning coal drives people into hospital and kills people. But there's also the alternatives are right there. So why are we still debating whether we need to do this or should do this? We know we have to do it. And of course, the more that we allow global average temperature to increase, the more we know that people will die in heat domes and people will be exposed to dangerous weather conditions, whether from falling tree branches or ice storms or rising sea levels or hurricanes or tornadoes. I mean, none of them are good for us. And doctors speaking to that has more power than politicians speaking to it, quite honestly.
Mm-hmm. Wow. What an incredible answer. That is super helpful. And I think that your end there talking about extreme weather events segues quite well into the next question we have from Audrey Campbell. She says, thank you for your great presentation and incredible work. I'm a public health physician and I'm reflecting on public health emergency management guidelines. In your work and travels, have you seen what you consider to be very strong or exceptional guidelines that focus on mitigation and response for extreme weather events?
I have to say I haven't yet. And that's maybe just my failing in not being aware of where there is such a jurisdiction. I was appalled with what was released this summer as an update to the federal adaptation strategy. And I mentioned it briefly, that the response to the heat domes, the goal being from the federal government that by 2040, no Canadians will die in heat domes. I like to say by tomorrow, no Canadians should die in heat domes. If you have appropriate responses and a healthcare protocol that lets you know what to do, there's no excuse for a Canadian dying in a heat dome. And for the federal government it's a sort of bureaucratic mindset of, okay, so everybody should have air conditioning. I mentioned this briefly. So everybody has air conditioning. Forget about what happens if the power goes out. Then people won't die in heat domes. That is an absolute abject failure of responding to an emergency. We know people don't need to die in heat domes. The numbers of British Columbians who died was directly related to, first of all, the provincial government refused to declare a state of emergency, even though they had several days warning that the temperatures were going to go into 40 to 45 degrees Celsius, not global average, sorry, 40 to 45 degrees Celsius in the communities. People are going to die when you see those kinds of forecasts. And the province didn't declare an emergency. None of the municipalities, and in many, many provinces, municipal governments are responsible for emergency preparedness. And many municipalities are it's not there. There's a few Torontos and Vancouvers out there, but there's also a lot of very small, very poor communities with no capacity to organize or respond. And for that matter, during the BC heat dome, again, there was no state of emergency declared. Municipalities weren't ready. They didn't open cooling centers. So the first responders, whether ambulance drivers or paramedics, were given instructions to just, and it was very, very slow, get people into ambulances, and they just died on the way to the hospital. We know that we do not have to have people dying of extreme heat in Canada. It's just a matter of figuring out all kinds of ways to reduce core body temperature, and everyone can think of the ways that you could do that without breaking the bank. first step would be to educate people to say, if if you're in an unair conditioned space and you get a warning, move yourself to somewhere air conditioned immediately. A lot of this is going to require social resilience and connectivity to know where is someone who's got mobility challenges, who's by themselves, who's cooking in a small box. Someone's got to know they're there, and someone's got to go get them and take them to someplace cooler, or draw them a cold bath and dump ice cubes in it and force them to sit in it. I mean, there's things you can do that aren't expensive, but it takes knowing. And I haven't seen any degree of preparedness, to answer your question, in any one jurisdiction that I could hold out and say, well, this is, but there may be one somewhere. But we really need to learn from the experiences we've had in the last few years of how to save lives with the tools that you've got as fast as you can, and not make it too bureaucratic.
We do have some questions about larger jurisdictions that you can help with as well. I do want to just add a couple notes on the previous two questions. So firstly, with Mealy's question, CAPE is hoping to use the clean electricity regulations in Ontario as opposed to gas-fired electricity expansion.
Excellent.
And just a quick note from Audrey as well. Thank you. There's much work to be done. I found Sarah Kendall's work that you mentioned. This is helpful. Moving on to, with just about 10 minutes left for Q&A, we have a question from Dr. Dworsky-Fraud. Thank you so much for your incredible presentation and advocacy. I was hoping to hear about whether there's been a noticeable shift that you have seen in regard to the public's understanding of climate change and willingness to act/vote on relevant policies.
Well, I hope to see the change in how people vote. I certainly think there's been a change in the conversation. There's certainly been a change in mainstream media. We have had, part of the problem with educating people to act on climate is that we've had a real erosion of capacity within journalism. But, we've had, sort of mainstream papers. There's been a big shift, I've noticed, in the editorial pages of the Globe and Mail. The fires this year really seem to have shaken them up. They've begun to realize that this is not a potential future threat, but a reality now, and that it's dangerous. And when people can't get out and enjoy going for a run in the morning, if people in Manhattan, for heaven's sakes, couldn't go out and walk their dogs because of the fires in Canada, it begins to hit people where they live, quite literally. And I think there is that shift. Whether it affects how people vote remains to be seen. Forgive me for complaint, but as leader of the Green Party in the 2019 election, we had 1 million people marching across Canada for climate action in September 2019 with Greta Thunberg. And environmental groups didn't do it either. Nobody actually looked at the platforms and said, which party is advocating targets and goals that align with the science? It was almost as if the media treated climate as being like the pride parades. So if your leader is out and marching in a pride parade, then they're on the right side on LGBTQ plus rights. And if your leader is out and marching, which is so Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau and I were all marching, and Andrew Scheer wasn't. So that was as far as the analysis went. Those guys are all good, and that other guy isn't. But there's a chasm of difference between the specifics of what the Greens are prepared to do to ensure we stay below the worst case scenario, stay below if we possibly can. If it's probably too late to stay below 1.5 degrees. Horrifically, but every fraction of a degree is going to make a difference in millions of lives. So we have to be able to, when voting time comes, have some help, please, about look at the platforms and who is advocating, which party is advocating what needs to be done, and mobilize around that. We do have an opportunity coming up, which I hope Greens will win. If any of you are from the Kitchener area, there's going to be a by-election in Kitchener Centre, and a Kitchener council member named Aislinn Clancy is the Green candidate. That's our next best hope to try to convince media, which is half the battle, and other Canadians that actually voters care about climate, because right now we don't have a lot of evidence that voters care about climate. I believe people do, but with every cynical ploy by any political party, you get discouraged people who decide it's not important to vote. So voter turnout goes down. Engaging Canadians to believe democracy makes a difference is an important step in this. And I also hate to mention it, but I think COVID damaged all of us because of the increase in disinformation, the willingness to attack, oh my God, to attack healthcare professionals, to attack nurses on the street. I mean, there's a really alarming lack of civility that's crept in through the rage farming and the notion of rage farming. The social media disinformation sites contaminate where we are on some health questions like vaccinations, just as they do on climate issues. But I think the window is there now. Canadians have really, I think, shifted in how much they think the climate emergency is personal and a willingness to take action. And I just hope we don't miss that opportunity, because as I said, since 1986, I've been watching us miss opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. And we just don't have any time left for failure, and we don't have any time left for procrastination.
Also, in the interest of time, if you're okay with it, I'm going to combine the last two questions and we'll leave it from there. So we have Rob's question, which is going back to the interprovincial electricity sharing. So Rob asked, do we have to open the Constitution to allow the interprovincial electrical sharing? And we'll also add in Rodney's question. In your opinion, why will the current federal government not stand up to the fossil fuel industry? As voters, what can we do to change this?
Thank you. Well, we don't have to open the Constitution. That's the good news, Rob. We do have to, I think, create a conversation about, 100% renewable electricity is possible for Canada. It's within reach. And the barrier is provincial utilities that don't want to talk to each other. I think if Canadians understood, if that was identified as a problem, the solutions would become more apparent. We do have some interprovincial dialogue happening. It's got its challenges. We really need to get the and of course the business model. Bear in mind, this is really exciting as a future possibility, is when the marginal cost of electricity or the marginal cost of energy approaches zero. What happens when you've got enough solar panels, enough geothermal, enough wind power, enough tidal, all of that becoming absolutely, once you've got your infrastructure in place, you're not paying for getting in new fuel to get your electricity to get to your home. You can install it in your own home. You can install solar panels. You can install wind. What happens then? The business model for the utilities goes belly up. Their business model is big, centralized mega projects that are all about supply, running over long wires to where somebody gets to use it. Very inefficient, loss of energy at every stage along the transmission lines. Decentralizing and democratizing energy is entirely doable and very exciting, but Canada's utilities will find it basically it's the equivalent of MAID for utilities. They're not going to want to sign up for that. So we have to figure out how to create the conversation that says we need to do this, because it's entirely possible to do it, and governments can drive that, and provinces can sign up for it. It wasn't easy to get the provinces to cut their sulfur dioxide emissions in half on acid rain, but they ended up all agreeing. So we need to have those kinds of conversations. As far as why don't the Liberals stand up to the fossil fuel lobby, part of it is that, politics always gets in the way, and everybody who's ever elected at any level of government is always looking for, how do I get reelected? And I'm speaking of the larger parties, because Greens really are focused on getting action on climate and social justice, and not selling out as we go. But part of the problem is for Trudeau is the Liberal Party always mistakenly believes it's about to elect people in Alberta. So if you were to go way back to the 1993 election promises of Jean Chrétien, the Red Book in 1993 was great on climate and made lots of pledges. And if Anne McClellan, the Liberal MP who got elected in Alberta that year with a margin of 17 votes, again, the Liberals started jettisoning their climate plans because they began to imagine that Anne McClellan, they had to make sure she gets reelected and elect other Liberals in Alberta. The sort of well, it's delusional that the Liberals are going to elect a lot of people in Alberta, but that has over and over again, including recently, stalled things that the federal government knew it should do, but it doesn't want to do it because Liberals think that they have this persistent delusion that they're going to elect Liberals in Alberta, so they cancel their own best plans over and over again. We now have a problem too with the NDP won't demand anything of Alberta that could possibly annoy Rachel Notley. So that's the NDP are never going to come out against the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So the politics of Alberta, short form for this answer, are just as big a problem as the power of the fossil fuel lobby. And you can't blame them. Everybody wants to keep the country together. I do too, but that's not the way I would go about it. Caving to Danielle Smith is not going to help anybody, and Canada needs to figure out how we as a federation actually function, and thinking like a country would help us deal with every issue we have in front of us. But that's a longer rant, but I think that's been a bigger obstacle than is often evident. That and when I talk to them, and I'm friends with everybody in Parliament, they say, "Oh, well, we're doing the best we can because it's not easy." Because well, you're not doing the best you can. If you were doing the best you can, you'd bring climate scientists in the floor of the House of Commons and make sure everybody had a serious climate briefing so they understand what we're talking about. The cabinet, just let me just imagine this. Cabinet members have never had a science briefing on the climate crisis. So they generally understand that they want to do something about climate. They want to be they want to be the good guys. But then they go ahead and buy the Kinder Morgan pipeline and waste $31 billion insisting on building it. They go ahead and approve Bay du Nord drilling in deep Atlantic Ocean waters. Thank goodness it looks like the Norwegian company that wants to do that is going to back out because it never made any sense economically. But the things that the Liberals should do, if they, and I think they mean well, but there's no really good evidence for that, they've really got to get good science into their brains and understand that if their policies don't meet the science, it's what Bill McKibben, whom I love, Bill McKibben, who's a really great climate activist and excellent author, I'm sure you all know of him. But Bill McKibben always says the difference between a government that says it cares about climate, but brings in, incremental policies that don't meet the science, and a government that's actually against climate action. The difference between the two of them is with one, you lose more slowly, but you're losing. And, we're stealing our children's future. We don't, failure is really not an option here. And that means doing some things that really require courage, like cancel the Trans Mountain Pipeline. The fallacy of sunk costs. Everybody says, "Oh, we spent so many billions of dollars. We really can't." You're not serious. You don't think we can really cancel it? For the love of God, of course you can cancel it. Anytime you cancel it, you'll save billions of dollars that you're otherwise spending on finishing it. And the same thing with banning fracking. The federal government should ban fracking. Various provinces have banned fracking, but fracking releases a lot of methane, threatens groundwater supplies. These things are possible, but the governments that are committed to incremental change, and that is a very seductive route. Incrementalism sounds so reasonable. We can only do what we can do after all. So we've made progress. It's better than nothing. We've taken this baby step, but it's so much better than the Conservatives. You've got to give us a break. I'm sorry. I think you're actually required to do what the science requires of you that you've committed to doing over and over again.
Thank you so, so much. I know you have another commitment, but I think that's such a, incredible note to end it on. I think, we're getting
Thanks.
some great comments. You've really inspired us all today, and certainly myself. So just
Thank you.
so much
Well,
gratitude
listen,
for you coming and all that you've done.
well, thank you all for choosing the profession you're in. God knows we need you. The healthcare crisis is another whole area that I also very committed to working on, and I have been. I think, again, thinking like a country helps us, making sure that we are making public single payer healthcare and the Canada Health Act getting enforced is really important, and making sure that when we do deals with the provinces again, we don't just write blank checks and give them money without saying, wait a sec, we've got to make sure you're actually creating the residency opportunities so that young medical students finishing medical school can get a residency in Canada and practice medicine in Canada. I mentioned Sarah Kendall because she's just brilliant. She happens to be my husband's niece, and she finished medical school, came back to Canada, can't get a, so she's going to be a physician in California. That's another brilliant young doctor that we've lost to Canada. She would have, loved to practice medicine in Canada. She's Canadian, but it's there's a lot that we need to do in terms of this federal provincial dialogue and figuring out how do we get the Canadian Federation to operate like a country instead of like separate balkanized fiefdoms. Longer rant. I should go to my next event, but I want to thank you all for being doctors and for inviting me to join you. I really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And thanks to all of our participants for coming to the first joint webinar. We hope to see you guys all again soon.
Thanks, Max. And thanks,
Thanks so much.
Ankita. Lovely to see you. Bye.